My boyfriend got wasted at a party and announced to everyone, "She's basically my maid with benefits, good for scrubbing toilets and paying rent, but way too boring for anything else." When I tried to leave, he grabbed my wrist and shouted, "Sit down. Lock, guys. She doesn't have the guts to walk away. Pathetic, isn't she?" His friends laughed while he blocked the door, waving my purse in the air. I just smiled and sat down, waited for the night to end. Today, I had 20 missed calls from his parents, begging me to answer. Okay, so first off, I don't know if I'm posting this in the right place. I usually just lurk and read other people's chaos, but I gotta get this out somewhere because honestly, what the actual hell? If you've ever had a moment where you're just like, am I the only one seeing this? Please let me know because I swear I started the night thinking I was just being paranoid. But by the end, I wanted to dropkick someone, and I do not mean that as a joke. My name is Valerie. I'm 29 years old and live in the suburbs of Los Angeles. I'm not loud, not rebellious, and not the type of woman who makes people turn around every time she walks by. I used to believe I was stronger than I looked. Honestly, I still think that. But there's one thing I never could have imagined, that one day, I would be humiliated in the middle of a party, in front of a room full of strangers, by the very man I once trusted the most. I met Ezra at an art exhibit held in late autumn inside an old warehouse that had been transformed into a gallery. He was standing by a painting of a decaying wooden door, with the light from the window casting a soft glow over his face. He didn't say much, but the way he quietly observed everything made me feel like he was someone I could trust. We started talking. There was nothing dramatic or romantic about it, just two strangers sharing thoughts on art, loneliness, and memory. Then came quick coffee dates, which gradually became longer. We spent weekends browsing flea markets, picking up forgotten trinkets that somehow came alive again in our hands. I started to believe that maybe, this time, I had chosen the right person. I'm not someone who falls in love easily, nor do I open up quickly. But around Ezra, everything felt natural. He made me feel at ease, like I didn't have to try or perform. We had been together for nearly a year when Ezra moved in with me. There were no roses, no proposal, just a quiet rainy afternoon when he said his lease was ending and I was complaining about my landlord raising the rent. Living together seemed like a sensible decision. It felt more practical than romantic. At first, things felt fine. Ezra liked to cook, and I enjoyed cleaning. He usually woke up earlier than I did and would make coffee first. Some nights, we curled up on the sofa and watched old movies, sharing popcorn and talking about the little details most people wouldn't notice. Ezra knew I was scared of cats, so he never pushed me to visit his friends who had them. He knew I loved things with history, so he never mocked the scratched-up wooden table I brought from my parents' home. I thought that was what peace felt like. But I didn't realize something back then. Peace, if not nurtured with respect, can easily become a trap. And I fell into that trap slowly and quietly, like someone who could no longer tell the difference between being loved and being used. Ezra eventually showed himself to be someone who wasn't good at remembering the little things in daily life. I was the one paying every bill on time, buying toilet paper, laundry detergent, and the snacks he liked. I was the one planning everything, preparing gifts for his friends' birthdays, and remembering that he needed a cup of honey ginger tea whenever he was tired. At first, I didn't think much of it. I assumed I was just being thoughtful. I had always been taught that a good woman is someone who takes care of her partner. But when that care becomes a one-sided responsibility, when everything I did was no longer acknowledged but merely expected, I started to feel drained. I shared this with Chloe, my best friend from college. She's straightforward and never hesitates to speak her mind. She looked at me with a mix of sympathy and frustration and told me I was living like someone who should be grateful her boyfriend hadn't left her. I didn't say anything back. I didn't argue because deep down, I knew she was right. Still, I stayed. I told myself everyone had flaws. I told myself I was just being too sensitive. I believed that if I was patient enough, things would improve. I continued being the one who did the shopping, the cleaning, the organizing, I kept folding Ezra's shirts every week, even though I couldn't remember the last time he asked if I was tired. Everything changed on a Saturday. Ezra and I were invited to a birthday party. The host was Ruby, the daughter of the landlord who owned the building where we were renting an apartment. I had only met her once during the lease signing, but Ruby was friendly and occasionally sent group messages to remind tenants about trash schedules, electricity bills, or community updates. Ezra was excited. He said it was a good opportunity to network. I didn't feel particularly interested, but I agreed to go with him. I had gotten used to staying quiet at other people's parties, trying to appear cheerful even when I always felt somewhat out of place. I never told Ezra that, because I didn't want to be labeled the negative one. The party was held in Ruby's penthouse. It wasn't extravagant, but refined enough to make me feel out of place in my simple linen dress. Everyone seemed to know one another. Ezra quickly blended in, striking up conversations with sharply dressed men, while I stood quietly near the dessert table, watching everything in silence. I noticed Ezra drinking quickly. By the time I had taken a few sips from my first glass, he was nearly done with his second. I gently reminded him to pace himself, but he just gave a dry smile and changed the subject. I started feeling uncomfortable as he kept joking about how I handled everything at home. The way he said it didn't sound like appreciation, but more like mockery. People around us laughed awkwardly, but no one said anything. I forced a smile, pretending nothing important had happened. I thought I could endure a little more. I didn't know that just a few hours later, Ezra would cross the final line, and my silence would no longer be an option. The atmosphere in Ruby's apartment grew louder by the minute. People moved from polite small talk to deeper, more personal conversations that I couldn't seem to join. I leaned against the small bar, slowly sipping my second glass of wine. Ezra was still in the center of a circle of new acquaintances. I could hear his laughter several times, and occasionally I'd catch my name thrown into the conversation, followed by whistles or awkward chuckles from unfamiliar men. I tried to stay calm. I wasn't the type to lose control in public. I still believed I could get through this party gracefully and talk to him tomorrow. I kept thinking that if I just held on a little longer, things wouldn't get worse. But some nights, fate doesn't give you a choice. Just as I was about to step out to the balcony for some fresh air, Ezra's voice suddenly echoed behind me, loud and full of energy. He stood in the middle of the living room, holding a beer, grinning as if he had just come up with something incredibly clever. He started talking about what it was like living with me. At first, his stories sounded harmless, about how I always remembered the bills, or how I had a habit of cleaning the kitchen immediately after cooking. People laughed politely, but then his tone shifted. The jokes became sharper, more cutting. He compared me to a full-time maid with perks, saying I was great at scrubbing toilets and paying rent, but too boring to be anything else. The room froze for a brief moment. A few people laughed, but it was that uneasy kind of laughter. Others looked down at their glasses, avoiding my eyes. Ruby glanced at me with visible discomfort. I didn't know what my face looked like at that moment. Maybe blank, maybe disappointed, maybe some unnameable mix of emotions. I set down my glass and slowly walked toward the door. I didn't intend to cause a scene. I didn't want to be the center of attention. I just wanted to leave, to escape that air, to escape the pity in their eyes, to escape the man I no longer recognized. But Ezra wouldn't let me. As I passed him, he reached out and grabbed my wrist. Not hard, but firm enough to make me stop. He smiled, his tone laced with sarcasm. He turned to the group, pointed at me, and said I didn't even have the courage to walk away, that I would just sit there, silent and submissive. And that was pathetic. Once again, a few people laughed. Still, that same uneasy kind of laughter, but this time I didn't stay frozen. I pulled my hand away from his grasp firmly, clearly. No one in the room said a word. No one stepped in. Not a single stop, not a single gesture of protest. The whole room stayed silent, as if afraid of getting dragged into an emotional mess they didn't want to be part of. I didn't say a word to Ezra. I just sat down on the nearest chair, picked up my purse that he had mockingly waved earlier, placed it on my lap, and stayed there. Silent. Just like the way I had lived for the past year in that apartment. Quiet, patient, always trying to preserve a peace that was never real. Ezra stood there a moment longer. When no one joined in his joke anymore, he backed off, poured himself another drink, and pretended nothing had happened. I sat there for nearly an hour, pretending to scroll through my phone, pretending not to hear the whispers, pretending not to see the way Ruby gently placed a glass of water beside me and whispered that I could leave whenever I wanted. But I had already decided I would not leave like someone who had just been humiliated. I stayed until the party was nearly over. When people began leaving, I got up, put on my coat, and walked toward the door. Ezra was standing there, arms crossed, expressionless. I didn't look back. I walked past him, each step feeling like I was lifting myself out of a place I had stayed trapped in for far too long. Ruby followed me out to the hallway and handed me the phone charger I had left behind. She didn't say much, just that I could message her anytime if I needed help with anything about the apartment. I nodded, thanked her, and walked away. I didn't cry on the way home. I didn't call Chloe, and I didn't call my mother. I just walked, slowly, listening to each sound my heels made against the cold pavement. The night wind brushed softly across my face, but it wasn't enough to soothe the pain that had just been uncovered inside me. When I arrived at the apartment, I opened the door, placed my bag in the closet, and sat down at the edge of the bed. Ezra came home about 10 minutes later. He slammed the door shut, said nothing, and didn't look at me. He just went straight into the bathroom, leaving the scent of alcohol and cigarette smoke lingering throughout the apartment. I sat there in the dark. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't play music. I didn't make tea. I simply sat in silence, more alert and clear-headed than I had been in a long time. For the first time in over a year, I didn't feel sad. What I felt was clarity. I could finally see one thing with certainty. I didn't love Ezra anymore. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because of an alarm, and not because I hadn't slept well, but because my body simply refused to stay any longer in a bed that had been cold for far too long. Ezra was still asleep on the sofa. He had never slept there unless we had fought or he was trying to make a point. I walked past him without a glance, without hesitation. Everything in my mind had become unmistakably clear. I went into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and saw a mess no one had cleaned up. The dishes from last night were still soaking in the sink. A thin layer of oil covered the countertop. There were dried orange juice stains from when Ezra had attempted to mix a cocktail and left it halfway. I stood there, staring at the familiar kitchen, and suddenly felt like a background character in my own story. I didn't clean. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat down at the table, and picked up my phone. There were 19 missed calls from Ezra's mother, 1 missed call from his sister, a few text messages from an unknown number, probably his father. The messages were long and emotional, asking if I was okay, if I could call back, saying that Ezra was worried, unstable, and really needed to talk. I didn't reply. I didn't read most of them. I simply put the phone down, opened the Notes app, and began writing. I wrote down everything I had done in the past year. The electricity, the water, the Wi-Fi bills, every pack of sanitary pads, every food container, every roll of toilet paper I had bought and never been reimbursed for. I listed every month I had paid the full rent because Ezra claimed he hadn't received his paycheck. I noted the times I had handed him my card so he could shop because his account had been frozen. I wasn't angry. I just needed to see the numbers, to know I wasn't crazy for feeling taken advantage of. Then I started to clean. Not for Ezra, for myself. I opened the closet and pulled out everything that was mine. I folded each item carefully and placed them in a travel bag. I took my camera, my laptop, my notebooks, my headphones, and the books I had kept next to the bed for months without ever opening them. I put them in a separate corner, ready to go. I wasn't planning to leave that day, but I knew I needed to get ready. I texted Chloe. I didn't explain much. She understood from just one sentence. She asked if I needed a place to stay. I told her not yet, but I might need a ride by the weekend. She replied with a fist emoji and one short message. Whenever you need. Ezra woke up around noon. He walked into the kitchen, looking tired and confused. I didn't look up. I stayed at the table, flipping through old photos I had taken years ago, remembering how bright my face once looked in those frames. He tried to speak, tried to sound gentle, tried to return to the role of the harmless boyfriend. He asked if I wanted to eat something, to watch a movie, or to talk. I answered with silence. Not because I was angry, not because I hated him, but because I no longer wanted to fix anything. That evening, I went grocery shopping alone. I didn't buy anything for Ezra. I didn't ask if he needed anything. For the first time in months, I bought only what I liked. A tub of coconut ice cream, a bundle of dried lavender, and an art magazine. I felt like I was slowly reclaiming small pieces of myself that had been forgotten. When I got home, Ezra was lying on the couch playing video games. The kitchen was still a mess, just like it was that morning. The living room smelled like the beer he had left open the night before. He looked at me as if expecting a familiar reaction. A scolding, a sigh, a cold stare. But I said nothing. I walked straight into the bedroom, closed the door, and for the first time in a long while, I slept peacefully in that room because I knew I wouldn't be there much longer. The next day, I took a day off from work. Not because I was sick, but because I needed a day to put my life back in order. I called the landlord to ask about the lease transfer process. They told me Ezra was the only one listed on the contract. I asked them to confirm again, then smiled quietly. That made things easier. I could leave without having to negotiate. I would leave this apartment, along with all the time and effort I had poured into it, to someone who never truly valued any of it. That afternoon, I continued packing my belongings. This time, I took a few more personal items, some old photographs, and the thick coat I had left in the closet waiting for winter. I realized that I had been emotionally preparing myself to leave for a very long time. It was just today that I had finally begun to take action. That evening, Ezra didn't say much. He didn't ask questions, didn't joke, and didn't pretend to care. Maybe he had sensed that my silence no longer meant endurance. It had become a final warning. And I knew that the next day I would really leave. That morning, the sky was unusually clear. Sunlight slipped gently through the curtains, soft but not warm. I woke up before my alarm. I hadn't had any dreams. I wasn't restless. There was only a quiet knowing inside me that today was the day. The room was still as quiet as ever, but I no longer felt like an outsider in my own space. I would leave today. Not with tears, but with clarity. Not because I stopped loving him, but because I had learned to love myself. I made myself a cup of coffee like I always did, but this time I stayed longer at the kitchen table. I looked around the apartment and saw every familiar corner clearly. The dining table I used to clean every night. The bookshelf I had organized carefully by color. The sofa where I once fell asleep after long days without anyone asking how I was. Every object held a little bit of me, but also stood as proof of how much I had given, quietly and consistently. I picked up my phone and sent a message to Chloe. She had said she would come by in the early afternoon, with her car and the same smile that had rescued me more times than I could count. I didn't need to take much, just what belonged to me both materially and emotionally. I didn't want to bring anything that had once been shared unfairly. I packed everything slowly and carefully. Ezra was still asleep. I could hear his steady snoring from the sofa, the heavy breathing of someone unaware that their life was about to change. Not because of something unexpected, but because of a decision made by someone he assumed would always stay. I didn't leave behind tears. I didn't leave behind accusations. I simply wrote a small note and placed it in the middle of the dining table, the place where he always sat without ever asking if I was tired. In that note, I listed every expense I had covered, and every time I had spoken on his behalf to the landlord, to his parents, and to his friends whom I never really knew. I didn't write a long letter. I didn't beg. I didn't try to explain. I only wrote the truth. That it was time for him to learn how to live his own life, just as I was learning to live mine. At the end, I wrote one short sentence. It was calm, but firm. Don't forget to clean the toilet. It's your turn now. Chloe arrived on time. She didn't say much. She opened the door, looked at me, and gave a quiet nod. We carried my things out to the car in silence. Each time I passed the living room, where Ezra was still lying asleep, I felt something inside me get a little lighter. I no longer needed him to wake up and see me leaving. I didn't need him to feel sorry. I didn't need a last-minute apology. What I needed was freedom, and I was reclaiming it one step at a time. When everything was ready, I went back into the apartment one last time. Not to say goodbye, but to make sure I hadn't left anything behind. I checked the fridge, the bathroom, the drawers of the desk. Then I walked out and gently closed the door. I dropped the key into the mailbox and turned to leave. Chloe played soft music in the car as we pulled out of the parking lot. Neither of us spoke for the first few minutes. Then she looked at me and asked the one question I'll remember forever. "Do you feel lighter now?" I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window at the buildings fading behind us. The place where I had lived, where I had tried, where I had sacrificed and hurt. The place I once thought was home, but in the end, it was only a space for hopes that had slowly faded. I didn't know if I felt lighter, but I knew one thing for sure. I didn't feel small anymore. I moved into Chloe's small apartment not far from the one I had just left. The space wasn't big, but it was warm enough for me to feel safe. I had my own room, a small desk in the corner, and a friend who always sat beside me when I needed a kind of quiet that didn't feel like loneliness. Chloe didn't ask for explanations. She didn't expect me to share details. She just left a glass of water for me each night, a few packets of herbal tea, and a soft blanket on the sofa. For me, that was healing without words, but the silence didn't last long. The very next morning, my phone wouldn't stop vibrating. The first call came from an unknown number. Then came a series of numbers without names, but I recognized them right away. It was Ezra's mother, then his sister. Then came a text from Ezra himself, a mix of short, angry bursts and long, rambling paragraphs filled with remorse. He said I had caught him off guard, that I had ruined everything, that I was heartless for leaving without a word. I read every message, but I didn't respond. He called me a traitor. Then, moments later, he called me the only person he couldn't live without. He blamed me for making his friends turn their backs on him, for making him look pathetic. Then he claimed he hadn't eaten all day, that he couldn't sleep, that the apartment now felt cold and empty. I set the phone down. Sitting on the couch, hugging a small pillow, I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I didn't feel guilty, but I did feel tired. Tired of the excuses. Tired of the cycle of blame, begging for forgiveness and then blaming again. People like Ezra don't need a partner. They need someone to lean on, to carry their responsibilities, and to blame when life doesn't go the way they want. That evening, Chloe opened her laptop and played an old comedy movie. We ate cold pizza, sipped soda, and for the first time in months, I laughed from the heart. But as the movie ended, my phone lit up again. It was a call from my mother. I answered. Her voice was soft and cautious, as if she already knew something was wrong. She said that Ezra's mother had contacted her, said that Ezra was unstable, that he needed me, that I shouldn't let him fall apart like this. I stayed silent for a few seconds. Then I told my mother that I was no longer the one responsible for holding up someone else's collapsing life. I was not a pillar for someone to lean on after they had burned down everything that held a relationship together. I had wanted to leave peacefully, but that peace was no longer respected. My mother didn't argue. She just sighed and said she trusted that I knew what I was doing. I was grateful for that. She didn't blame me. She didn't take sides. She simply stood there, quietly and steadily, as a place I could return to. The next day, I got a message from Ruby. She told me Ezra hadn't paid the rent that month, and the building owner had sent an official warning. I apologized for any trouble that might have involved me. Ruby replied that she understood exactly who was pulling everything down. She told me that if I needed to retrieve any belongings left in the apartment, she could open the door for me. That afternoon, I went back to the old apartment. It was the first time since I had left. I went alone. Ezra wasn't there. The place was quiet, messy, and cold. The air smelled of damp laundry. Signs of unfinished meals were scattered around. The TV screen was still on, though no one had been watching. I picked up a few books I had left behind, a small photo frame, and the blender I had bought during a holiday sale. Before I left, I stood by the door, looking around one last time. This apartment was once the place I had tried to turn into a home. Now, it was just a box filled with old illusions. I knew I didn't belong there anymore. That night, I received a message from a mutual friend of mine and Ezra's. She told me that Ezra was telling people I had walked away without giving a reason, that I had hurt him, that I had humiliated him. I gave a faint smile. I wasn't surprised. People like Ezra are always the victim in their own version of the story. They will revise every memory to make sure that doesn't change. I didn't explain myself to anyone. I didn't post anything online. No pictures, no pity stories. I just kept living. I spent time writing, reading, and growing a few small plants on the balcony of Chloe's apartment. I went to update my bank cards. I changed my mailing address. I rebuilt my routines in a way that belonged only to me. I learned how to live again as a whole person, not the other half of something broken. I knew the blaming wouldn't stop anytime soon. Ezra would keep calling, texting, trying to reach me through mutual friends, through social media, maybe even through people I didn't expect. But I also knew this. The more silent I stayed, the louder the truth would become. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of loneliness. I saw it as a clean, open space. A place where I could start over. A place where every step, every breath, and every voice belonged only to me. 3 weeks after I left, my life finally started to take on a different rhythm. I was still staying with Chloe, but I had already found a small apartment of my own. It was a simple space on the 3rd floor of an old building, with a window that welcomed the morning light and a balcony just big enough for a few new pots of lavender. I painted the walls a soft cream color, placed my desk by the window, and hung a wooden wind chime I had kept since I lived with my parents. I didn't need many things. I didn't bring the gifts Ezra once gave me. I didn't hold on to any keepsakes that might pull me back into a faded past. I chose to keep only what truly belonged to me. I held on to the small rituals that made me feel like myself, from reading a few pages every morning to brewing a cup of herbal tea after work. I called it a small act of love for myself. Chloe came by every weekend. We cooked together, listened to music, and sometimes lay on the wooden floor telling old stories. We no longer told them with bitterness, only with sighs that had grown lighter over time. I also started writing again, not about Ezra, but about myself. I wrote journal entries that recorded my healing. I wrote quiet thoughts late at night. I wrote about the little things that once disappeared in the rush of everyday life. I wrote for myself, and for every woman who had ever felt she had to stay silent to keep a love that was no longer good for her. Ezra kept trying to reach out during the first few weeks. His messages grew less frequent. His words shifted from anger to pity. He said he had lost everything. Even his friends and family no longer stood by him like they used to. I didn't feel glad about it, and I didn't feel satisfied either. I just knew that when you live with lies and selfishness, the consequences come not because someone ruins you, but because you lose everything of value all on your own. I didn't hate Ezra. I simply no longer had room for him in my life. One Sunday afternoon, I sat on the balcony with a new book. The breeze was gentle. The lavender beside me swayed softly. I could hear children playing in the park nearby and music drifting from the apartment below. I put the book down and closed my eyes. Inside, there was no panic, no regret, just a quiet peace that felt real. a kind of peace that didn't need to be forced or protected. I realized I didn't need anyone else to feel whole. I didn't need to prove anything. I only needed to live honestly and kindly, and never lose myself for anyone again. One day, my mother called and told me she was proud of me for knowing when to walk away. I didn't say much. I just smiled. Because I understood that sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is not to hold on, but to let go and walk away when love is no longer love. A few weeks later, I changed my phone number. It wasn't because I was afraid. It was because I wanted to cut off the noise I no longer needed. I cleared out every message, deleted all the photos, and unfollowed every social media account connected to Ezra. Not because I was angry, but because I no longer needed to look back. I was ready to move forward without turning around. On the day I moved into my new home, I wrote one short sentence in my notebook. This is the place where no one has the right to call me a maid in bed again. This is the place where I get to be myself, fully. And with that, I closed the old chapter with a quiet smile. No one can take your self-worth from you unless you hand it over. No one can keep hurting you if you find the strength to say it's over. I said it. Not with shouting, but with silence. Not with drama, but with action. And now, I am free. If you are watching this video and feel like you are slowly shrinking inside a relationship, please remember this. You deserve kindness. You deserve peace. You deserve a love that doesn't ask you to sacrifice yourself just to be accepted. This is her side of the story. Here, we tell the stories from the perspective of the one who should have been heard all along. Thank you for staying until the end. We'll see you in the next story, where women don't just relive what happened to them. They choose to move forward with power and grace.